Hi, folks. Welcome back. Congratulations. You've made it. This is the last lecture in the class. So well done. Today we're going to talk about the rise of smooth jazz, which through a couple of artists sort of brought a type of jazz back into the spotlight. But smooth jazz is not generally regarded as the most innovative stuff. So a lot of jazz traditionalists are not big on smooth jazz, but we eventually would then get a rise and a return to traditional jazz and through a couple of particular artists in general and some movements towards sort of like a jazz revival, you will get a return to more classic jazz fare in the 1980s. Again, I asked you all to, as a subject of your second research paper, to do a little research on more current jazz artists. And hopefully that'll open up some doors and get you, when you're listening to a record, you hopefully might find something you're interested in and discover more things. But as jazz sort of dwindled with jazz rock fusion and the loft scene being everything sort of being pushed underground in the 70s, you start to kind of dig out of it a little bit here in the 80s. Okay. Before we get to that, we're going to talk about this type of jazz called smooth jazz, which was kind of adult contemporary, kind of watered down, listener friendly. In a lot of ways, it is fusion because it's fusing. There's oftentimes a lot of electric sounds in it, so it kind of has elements of fusion, but it's not nearly as experimental, and it's again trying to capture like a pop music audience in a sense. Sometimes called again adult contemporary music, Weather Channel music. They used to play music like this on the Weather Channel when they were doing like the local things. Um, the, Basically, smooth jazz. We've kind of gone through this cycle a couple of times, and this will be the last time we talk about it specifically. But if you go back to Paul Whiteman being white and the king of jazz, but some people may have bought Paul Whiteman records thinking, well, I'm into jazz, and it sort of opens them up to the jazz world, or the height of the swing era, with Benny Goodman being the king of swing, and Tommy Dorsey and Glenn Miller, all these white bands playing a lot of pop tunes. They're not necessarily innovating, but they're playing a lot of pop music and bringing people into the fold, right? They just happen to be white, and the black musicians are typically doing things that are a little more innovative, right? Which would eventually be bebop in that case. The same thing happens here with smooth jazz. And it won't be exclusively white, but you'll get two people in particular, one in the 70s, one in the 80s, who are white. They're very good musicians, but they sort of water the music down and get this really sort of relaxed, mellow thing. The same thing happens actually with cool jazz from before, and the cool jazz to hard bop dynamic, where cool jazz became West Coast cool, very white, very mellow, very watered down, and hard bop is a reaction and more aggressive and more earthy and more ethnic and more black in a lot of ways, funky. The same thing is kind of going to happen here with smooth jazz, where you get this arrival of sort of watered down vanilla jazz music that will be quite popular, is going to sell a lot of records, but it's not exactly generally accepted as very innovative or great jazz music. But it plays to a lot of people, and they like it. Okay, so that's what we're going to talk about here, smooth jazz, and there could be an offshoot of smooth jazz called soul jazz as well, and so we'll talk about these. The term fusion sort of fell out of favor in the 80s. It ran its course through the 70s. There will still be jazz artists doing fusion with electronic instruments and whatnot, but they don't call it fusion anymore. And in fact, the term jazz even fell out of favor. So they stopped necessarily using the term jazz. Okay. But fusion had been used, and as obviously we've talked about, was a really big deal. But now by the 80s, it's sort of fallen out of favor, right? But it gets going to get replaced in a lot of ways by smooth jazz. Okay. Before we get to smooth, let me talk about like a subcategory of smooth, which is soul jazz. In 1967, a gentleman by the name of Creed Taylor, he was a producer on some early Miles Davis solo projects. He started his own record label, Creed Taylor Incorporated, CTI. And Creed Taylor wanted to make jazz records that, kind of like Miles Davis, would reach a lot of people. So instead of doing really progressive free jazz, doing really experimental avant-garde, really complicated bebop, he would do very sort of listener-friendly music. And in 1967, well, that is sort of, you're starting to get like soul music has been going for a while. You're starting to get the beginnings of funk. James Brown and things like that are really taking that music in a new direction. So soul jazz really bridges the gap and, in a sense, fuses jazz with soul music or with funk music, kind of like what Herbie Hancock is going to do with the Headhunters, right? So he's creating jazz as a pop music. And there are other things in addition to like Herbie Hancock. For example, the trumpet player Freddie Hubbard recorded this record called Red Clay in 1970. I'm going to put up the tune Red Clay. It sounds like a fusion record because it has electronic instruments. The trumpet playing is sort of amplified and that kind of stuff. But instead of being a psychedelic sort of trumpet fusion thing like Bitches Brew with Miles Davis, this is much more of a soul thing. It's groovy. It's funky, right? It's actually a really great record. And there are other things that they did too, CTI Records. They took the fanfare to Also sprach Zarathustra, which is a famous orchestral piece by Richard Strauss. You may recognize the fanfare. He turned it into a jazz tune, and it actually sort of has a disco beat. So much so that it actually was #2 on the Billboard Hot 100. And that's the pop charts. That's not a jazz chart. So I'm going to upload Deodato's Also sprach Zarathustra, which is, again, sort of the classical music fanfare played on electric keyboards and stuff. Deodato wasn't a keyboard player. And again, sort of with a dance-friendly beat. And that became actually a pop hit that crossed over to hit the pop charts. Other artists, Grover Washington Jr. was a saxophone player. He had a really big album called Mr. Magic. George Benson, a very well-known guitar player and singer, he made this record called Breezin', which was very well received. Tunes like On Broadway, George Benson was really famous for. And I'll share with you some links. And these are all examples of sort of soul jazz, listener-friendly, but still sort of groovy stuff. Not exactly smooth jazz, which is, I would argue, is watered down further. Soul jazz tries to fuse essentially jazz with soul music. Okay, but it is pretty easy listening in a lot of ways, and that then brings us to smooth jazz. Okay, and smooth jazz is this listener-friendly, sort of really kind of watered down, in a lot of ways, elevator music in a sense. And there'll be two main players of smooth jazz that I really want to drive home here. The first being Chuck Mangione. Chuck Mangione played the flugelhorn, which is a trumpet, slightly bigger. Miles Davis played the flugelhorn on some of the Third Stream records. It's sort of a mellower sounding trumpet. Chuck Mangione was a white trumpet player from Rochester. He actually played with his brother Gap in a group called the Jazz Brothers. I want to drive home the point that Chuck Mangione was a very accomplished jazz musician. He went to the Eastman School of Music, played with Art Blakey and the Jazz Messengers. He was a great player. He just happened to make a record at a time, sort of like this sort of, again, smooth jazz record at a time in the early 70s, and it was a wildly popular. This particular song is called "Feels So Good." It was 1977, I guess. And as you can see, here it is, lighter rock influenced sound, very popular. A lot of people did not consider this to be jazz at all, but he he himself still performs at leading jazz festivals, and he is a great improviser. You don't hear it on this tune. This is, again, more of an easy listening tune. In fact, he does nothing other than play the melody on the flugelhorn. There's a guitar solo in the tune, but there's, it's not a tremendous amount of improvisation. But this is the sort of stuff, again, that reaches a wider audience. Paul Whiteman's group didn't improvise much, but was the biggest white band of the 1920s, right? Glenn Miller's band didn't improvise a whole lot, but was a huge success during the swing era. So when you get too heavy into the improvisation, oftentimes you lose a lot of fans. And Chuck Mangione definitely reached a lot of fans with his song "Feels So Good." It actually was #2 on the pop charts. And a lot of people think this is sort of the birth of smooth jazz. Traditionalists argue that this isn't really real jazz. Chuck Mangione very much was a jazz musician, a very good jazz musician, and still is. He just happened to make a record that was really popular. So I'm going to upload "Feel So Good." I wouldn't be at all surprised if you had heard this tune before. Okay, this brings me to the context that jazz itself started to become like a bad word. A lot of groups actually dropped the name jazz from their titles because it would hinder album sales. There was a group called the Jazz Crusaders that changed their name to Crusaders just because, again, during the 70s, jazz was dying. It was on life support. People weren't going to buy it. So it was billed in other ways: adult contemporary, new adult contemporary, jazz light, the quiet storm on late night radio demographic, that kind of stuff. Sort of instrumental, adult contemporary, easy listening music. Music for what they called the money demographic, which was ages 25 to 54. People who had perhaps outgrown the rock music of the 60s, of their adolescence, and now weren't really following rock music through the 70s or the 80s. And we're looking for some sort of alternative, but they didn't want to go full on into jazz. They were looking for more of this lighter, easy listening thing. Smooth jazz fit that for a lot of people, like Chuck Mangione or like Kenny G. Kenny G is arguably the most well-known smooth jazz artist ever. And if you do not know who Kenny G is, ask your parents, first of all. And then second of all, is more than likely you have heard some of Kenny G's songs, particularly a song called Songbird, which was on the album Breathless. Kenny G's real name was Kenneth Gorelick, and he was a saxophone player, a white saxophone player, originally from Seattle. He started in a fusion band known as the Jeff Lorber Band. He was a very skilled jazz musician. But he happened to understand that to reach a big audience, you're going to play kind of some very melodic, watered down sort of stuff without a tremendous amount of improvisation. Don't want to scare a lot of people away. Let's just make some music that people can enjoy. And he did that. He did that very, very well. Had sold out like tours all across the world, sold over 48 million records for a jazz artist. Again, jazz, many people would put quotations around that. He wasn't Duke Ellington. He wasn't Count Basie. He wasn't Miles Davis. But he was a skilled jazz musician. He just happened to travel into this smooth jazz realm, which, again, a lot of traditional jazz artists sort of despise. But, how much is your reputation worth when you can sell 48 million recordings? And retire and now play golf every day. He's an avid golfer. So I'm going to upload the song Songbird, which, again, would not surprise me at all if you've heard. And it is in itself a form of fusion because it's taking sort of the electronic sounds of the 1980s, of like almost like a Madonna record in a sense. But he's playing his soprano saxophone over the whole thing. Okay? That's smooth jazz. Those are the heavyweights of smooth jazz, in particular, Kenny G and Chuck Mangione. There are many, many others, but all of them are overshadowed by Kenny G. He was wildly, wildly successful. Okay, so if smooth jazz is sort of the soundtrack of the 80s, where does it go from there? Well, jazz would incorporate, other artists would experiment and incorporate the hip-hop influence. There was actually a hip hop group, not a jazz group, but a hip hop group named Diggable Planets. They would actually sample hard bop jazz records. So they would sample like Horace Silver records or the Jazz Messengers when they were making their albums. Tribe Called Quest, similar sorts of things, right? This was when hip hop became a thing, rose up through the 70s, and in the early 80s, it really broke through. This was something that was going on. Herbie Hancock and the tune Rocket fused hip hop and jazz there for a while. Miles Davis, before he passed away, his last album, Tutu, was working in the hip hop realm, obviously with him playing the trumpet. So this continues and continues to this day, the hip hop influence in jazz. Okay. There are, again, countless other things going on as well. What then I will lead to at this point is in the 80s, you get a return to neoclassical or neo-traditional jazz, the new traditional, the new classical jazz, which is you're going to see the arrival of that in a video clip that kind of features Wynton Marsalis, who was one of the primary narrators of the Ken Burns clip the entire time as a trumpet player. This is a return to what jazz used to be, more straight ahead, kind of hard bop sort of language, and earlier, using traditional acoustic jazz instruments, not electronic instruments. Going back to the swing feel predominantly. Of course, there are always exceptions. More individual solo space, not collective free jazz improvisation like that. Traditional roles for the rhythm section, going back to accompanying the instrumentalists instead of doing their other unusual sorts of things that they had developed over the years. Just going back to kind of the bebop, hard bop, modal jazz, and that sort of stuff. Even a return in many ways to Dixieland or the swing era, depending on what type of music they are recording. The primary source here is a gentleman by the name of Wynton Marsalis, who again was one of the big figures in the film clips you've been seeing. With Wynton Marsalis' arrival, and you'll see this in a film clip, the floodgates sort of opened, and there was a return of traditional jazz playing, but also new players that are now taking the music in different directions. So again, the subject matter of your final research paper is some of the new directions that are happening now in the 21st century. Okay. Marsalis himself was a bit of a child prodigy from a musical family. His father was a great jazz piano player and educator in New Orleans. All of Marsalis's brothers play instruments. Branford plays saxophone. Delfeo plays trombone, that kind of stuff. He got his start with Art Blakey and the Jazz Messengers when he was 19 years old, studying at Juilliard. He then quickly started his own group. At age 22, he became the first artist to win a Grammy in the same year, both in classical and jazz. He did that the very next year at age 23 as well. He's the only artist to ever have done that. And he did it twice. Again, exclusively on acoustic instruments. He ruffled a lot of feathers early on. In 1983, Miles Davis was still around doing fusion things, but now he's doing more hip-hop fusion or getting towards that. But Wynton Marsalis was very outspoken about how much, that's not jazz, that's, BS, blah, blah, blah. And he ruffled a lot of feathers with a lot of people. Outspoken on the subject of what is jazz. Stated that fusion was not real jazz and stuff like that. But through his appearances on these film clips and all of his work as a recording artist and as an educator, he's sort of become the public face of jazz. He leads jazz at Lincoln Center, which is an orchestra that plays at the Lincoln Center Jazz Complex, but which is right next to the Metropolitan Opera and Juilliard School of Music and that kind of stuff. Avery Fisher Hall, which is where the New York Philharmonic plays. Jazz now has a sort of a permanent monument itself, which is the Lincoln Center Jazz building. And he is this very outspoken face, and they tour all over the place and that kind of stuff. So you've seen lots of Wynton Marsalis. I'm going to share with you a couple of clips of Wynton Marsalis as well, and sort of this return to the old-fashioned way of doing things and a revival of jazz. And this was in the 80s and the early 90s, basically. And that's kind of where we are now. And again, jazz as a general rule, or is really a it's hard to pigeonhole jazz because so many people are doing so many different things. From the big bands that I just shared with you the other day, that are still active, Maria Schneider, Dave Holland, things like that, to the individual artists that you're going to do your research papers on. Um, Lots and lots of people are doing a wide variety of things. It's really a overlooked style of music that most people don't get into. They're not introduced to it. You don't hear this music on the radio. You do not necessarily uh, see the artist doing this. You don't. Most people don't stream their music. It's just one of many types of examples of really outstanding musicians playing really outstanding music that necessarily doesn't necessarily get a lot of mainstream attention. But that's kind of where jazz is now. So that's it, folks. You did a great job. Thanks for sticking with me. Like I said, that is all you need to know up until this point, right? This is all the material you'll need for your final exam. I will share with you another study guide to kind of get you ready for that. Make sure you send me all of your papers and get everything into me on time before the class is over. And that's it. So let me know if you have any questions at all. Otherwise, it's been a pleasure sort of hanging out with you, and we will see you again soon. Bye bye.